The morning sun broke through the clouds as Captain James Harrington polished his boots in the quiet corner of the barracks. His fingers moved with practiced ease, buffing the leather to a mirror shine that reflected his own serious face. At 42, the lines around his eyes told stories of duty, honor, and sacrifice that words alone could never capture. 15 years, he whispered to himself, hardly believing how quickly time had passed since he'd first put on the uniform. The Royal Guard had become more than just his job. It was his identity, his purpose, his family. In the background, the radio hummed with the morning news. James barely listened, his mind already preparing for the day ahead. His commanding officer had informed him yesterday about the court summons. A simple matter, really. He just needed to give testimony about what he'd seen during that scuffle near the palace gates last month. "Shouldn't take more than an hour of your time, Harrington," Major Phillips had said with a casual wave of his hand. "Just show up, tell the truth, and be on your way." James set down the polishing cloth and inspected his reflection in his boots. Perfect as always. He'd never been one to cut corners, not even on the smallest details. That's why the other guards looked up to him, why the younger recruits sought his advice, why his name came up whenever difficult assignments needed handling. Standing up, he stretched his tall frame, feeling the familiar twinge in his left shoulder, a souvenir from his second tour in Afghanistan. The memory flashed unbidden. The scorching heat, the explosion, the ringing in his ears, the weight of his wounded comrade as he carried him to safety. 7 men saved that day. The medal ceremony afterward felt like someone else's life. His dress, uniform hung perfectly pressed in his locker. James ran his fingers along the bright red fabric, feeling the stiff collar and polished buttons. Each medal and ribbon told a chapter of his story. Bravery under fire in Helmand Province, exceptional service during the royal wedding security detail, the Queen's personal commendation after he spotted a potential threat during a public ceremony. "You're wearing the full dress?" asked Thomas, his bunkmate, peering over from his bed where he was lacing up his own boots. James nodded. "Protocol for official appearances. Royal Guard represents the Crown in all formal settings." Thomas whistled. "Bit much for a minor court case, isn't it? Those judges don't care much for all the pomp." "It's not about what they care for," James replied, taking the uniform from its hanger. "It's about what the uniform stands for." As he dressed, methodically securing each button and straightening each medal, James thought about his father, a guardsman himself for 27 years. He'd passed away 3 winters ago, but James could still hear his voice. "The uniform isn't just cloth and thread, son. It's history, it's tradition, it's every man who wore it before you and every man who will wear it after." The ceremonial sword was the final piece. James attached it to his belt with careful hands. The weight of it felt right, balanced. In 15 years, he'd never drawn it outside of ceremonial duties, but its presence completed the uniform that had become his second skin. Outside the barracks, London was already buzzing with morning traffic. James walked with perfect posture toward the subway station, aware of the glances he received from passers-by. Children pointed, tourists snapped photos, and several people nodded respectfully as he passed. He acknowledged them with slight nods, maintaining the dignified bearing expected of the Queen's Guard. On the train, an elderly woman insisted he take her seat. "My late husband was military," she explained with misty eyes. "Royal Navy, 42 years of service." "Thank you, ma'am," James replied with genuine warmth. "Your husband's service honors us all." These moments always reminded him why the uniform mattered. It wasn't vanity or showmanship. It was a living connection to generations of service, to values that still meant something in a world that sometimes seemed to have forgotten them. Dineo. Courthouse loomed ahead, a grand stone building with wide steps leading to imposing doors. James checked his watch, 30 minutes early, as was his habit. He climbed the steps, each footfall precise and measured. Inside, the marble halls echoed, with hurried footsteps and hushed conversations. James approached the security desk, presented his identification, and explained his purpose. The security officer, a burly man with gray at his temples, looked up from his computer screen. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of the full dress, uniform, Courtroom 4, Captain, he said, standing a bit straighter himself. Judge Pierce is presiding today. He hesitated, then added quietly, word of advice. He runs a tight ship and doesn't much care for ceremony. Might want to prepare yourself. James thanked him with a nod, but felt no concern. He'd faced gunfire and bombs. Surely a judge's courtroom wouldn't present any challenge he couldn't handle with proper decorum and respect. As he waited in the hallway outside Courtroom 4, James reviewed the facts of the case in his mind. The disturbance had been minor, a drunk tourist trying to provoke a reaction from the guards on duty, then becoming belligerent with police when they intervened. James had witnessed the entire incident while supervising the changing of the guard. Captain Harrington? A young court clerk approached, clipboard in hand. They'll be ready for you in about 10 minutes. Thank you, James replied. That's quite the uniform, the clerk commented, eyes taking in the bright colors and gleaming metals. Standard protocol for court appearances, James explained politely. The clerk nodded, though his expression suggested uncertainty. Right. Well, just to let you know, Judge Pierce likes things simple, no fuss. I understand, James said, though, in truth, he wasn't sure what the young man was implying. The Royal Guard had clear regulations about proper attire for official functions, including court appearances. There was no question of appearing in anything less than full dress uniform. The, massive wooden doors to Courtroom 4 opened, and the clerk gestured for James to enter. As he stepped through the doorway, James had no inkling that his routine testimony was about to become something far more significant. A moment that would test not just his composure, but the very respect due to the institution he had devoted his life to serving. The courtroom was smaller than James had expected, with dark wood paneling that made the space feel even more confined. Rows of wooden benches filled the public gallery, already occupied by a handful of observers, lawyers with briefcases, and family members of those involved in the day's cases. The air smelled of furniture polish and old books. James stood at attention, just inside the doorway, waiting to be called forward. His gaze swept across the room, taking in the raised judge's bench, the witness stand to its side, and the tables where the prosecution and defense sat shuffling through papers. Years of military training had taught him to notice details, exits, positions, potential threats, even when there was no danger present. A middle-aged woman with reading glasses hanging around her neck looked up from her stenography machine and did a double-take at the sight of his bright red uniform. She wasn't the only one. A wave of whispers rippled through the courtroom as heads turned in his direction. The court clerk approached, gesturing toward a wooden chair near the front. Wait there, please. You'll be called when needed. James nodded and made his way forward. His boots clicked against the polished floor, eerily loud in the hushed room. The ceremonial sword at his side, a symbol of centuries of tradition, tapped gently against his leg as he walked. Behind the imposing bench sat Judge Malcolm Pierce, a man in his 60s with thinning gray hair and heavy-framed glasses. He didn't look up as James took his seat, too focused on the papers before him. The case being heard was drawing to a close, something about a property dispute between neighbors. Judgment will be issued in writing within 14 days, the judge announced, his voice clipped and impatient. Next case. The clerk stood. The Crown versus William Patterson, Your Honor. Disturbance of the peace and resisting arrest. James recognized the case immediately. Patterson was the tourist who'd tried to make the palace guards laugh, then shoved a police officer when asked to move along. A straightforward case where James's testimony would simply confirm what had already been established. As the lawyers prepared their materials, Judge Pierce finally glanced in James's direction. His eyes narrowed and his mouth tightened into a thin line. James met his gaze respectfully but didn't look away. And who is this colorful addition to my courtroom? The judge asked, his tone making the question sound like an accusation. The prosecutor, a young woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, stood quickly. Captain James Harrington, Your Honor, witness for the prosecution. He observed the incident while on duty with the Royal Guard. Judge Pierce removed his glasses, polishing them with a handkerchief while studying James with undisguised annoyance. Captain, is it? Tell me, Captain, do you normally attend traffic court, dressed as if you're about to guard Buckingham Palace? A few nervous laughs echoed through the courtroom. James remained perfectly still, his face betraying no emotion. Stand when I address you, the judge snapped. James rose to his feet in one smooth motion, his posture impeccable. Yes, Your Honor. Yes, Your Honor, what? Answer my question. Is this how you normally dress for court appearances? This is the proper dress uniform required by Royal Guard regulations for all official appearances, including court testimony, Your Honor, James replied evenly. The judge's eyebrows rose so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. And that sword? You thought it appropriate to bring a weapon into my courtroom? The prosecutor intervened again. Your Honor, ceremonial swords are permitted under— I didn't ask you, Judge Pierce cut her off sharply. I'm addressing the man who looks like he's wandered in from a tourist postcard. The courtroom had gone completely silent now. Even the defendant and his lawyer were watching the exchange with wide eyes. Judge Pierce pointed a finger at James. Are you planning to stage a coup in my courtroom? We don't need all this pompous regalia here. This isn't a parade ground. James stood perfectly still, his years of standing guard outside the palace, remaining composed while tourists made faces, took photos, and sometimes even shouted insults, serving him well now. His expression revealed nothing, though his chest tightened with an uncomfortable mix of surprise and indignation. The sword is purely ceremonial, Your Honor, he said calmly. It's part of the uniform. The judge's face flushed slightly. Part of the uniform, he repeated mockingly. Well, this is a court of law, not a costume party. That theatrical outfit might impress tourists, but it has no place here. A woman in the gallery gasped softly. James could feel everyone's eyes on him, but he kept his gaze steady on the judge. Your Honor, the prosecutor tried again. There's legal precedent for— Ms. Chen, please control your witness, Judge Pierce interrupted. Captain, if that is indeed your real rank and not just part of this pantomime, I suggest you remove that fancy dress before giving testimony. This is a serious proceeding, not the changing of the guard. The defendant, a heavy-set man with a scruffy beard, smirked at James from his seat. The very man who had disrespected the guard post was now watching a judge do the same to a senior officer. James felt his jaw tighten, but forced himself to maintain his composure. In 15 years of service, including combat zones and royal ceremonies, he had never been dressed down like this, especially not for following protocol. Permission to address the court, Your Honor? James asked, his voice steady despite the public humiliation unfolding around him. Judge Pierce waved his hand dismissively. Go ahead, Captain Fancy Dress. Enlighten us all. Someone in the gallery stifled a laugh. James took a deep breath, aware that his response in this moment mattered. Not just for himself, but for the uniform he wore, and everything it represented. The weight of tradition and honor rested on his shoulders as he prepared to speak. James felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom upon him. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft ticking of the wall clock and someone's nervous cough from the back row. He stood straight, shoulders squared, the same way he'd stood through freezing winter days outside Buckingham Palace and scorching summer ceremonies. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Remember, son, when you wear that uniform, you're not just James Harrington anymore. You carry the honor of every guardsman who came before you. With that thought steadying him, James addressed the court in a clear, measured voice that betrayed none of the anger bubbling beneath the surface. Your Honor, with all due respect, I appear before you today not only as a witness but as a serving member of Her Majesty's Royal Guard. This uniform and ceremonial sword represent not personal vanity, but 15 years of service to the crown and country. Judge Pierce rolled his eyes dramatically, but James continued before the judge could interrupt. Royal protocol requires guards to appear in full dress uniform when representing the service in official capacity. I would be in dereliction of duty to appear otherwise. The judge tapped his pen impatiently against the bench. Spare me the lecture? On palace etiquette, Captain. This is my courtroom, not Her Majesty's garden party. Several spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The prosecutor, Ms. Chen, shuffled through her papers, clearly distressed by the unexpected conflict. Even the court clerk looked up from his notes, watching the exchange with wide eyes. James kept his voice steady. "I'm aware of where I am, Your Honor, and I'm also aware of the legal statute that permits uniformed service members to appear in court in full dress, including ceremonial weapons, when testifying in their official capacity." Judge Pierce's eyebrows shot up. "Are you presuming to lecture me on the law, Captain?" "No, Your Honor," James replied. "I'm simply stating the facts as I understand them. Section 28 of the Courts Act specifically protects the right of military personnel to appear in proper uniform, including ceremonial sidearms, when appearing as representatives of their service." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Judge Pierce's face, quickly replaced by deepening annoyance. He hadn't expected the guardsman to know the law so well. "The law also gives me authority over the conduct of my courtroom," the judge countered, "and I find your appearance disruptive." From the gallery, an older gentleman with a military bearing leaned forward, watching intently. A few rows behind him, a young woman was quietly recording the exchange on her phone, her expression a mixture of outrage and fascination. James nodded respectfully. "I understand, Your Honor. However, disruption was never my intent. I'm here simply to provide truthful testimony in the case before the court, as is my duty both as a citizen and as a guardsman." The tension in the room was palpable. The defense, attorney for Patterson, sensing an opportunity in the conflict, stood up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your Honor, if I may suggest, perhaps we should proceed with other witnesses and return to Captain Harrington when he's more appropriately attired?" James turned slightly to face the attorney. "Sir, with respect, what you're suggesting would require me to violate direct orders regarding proper attire for official appearances." The defense attorney's smile faltered. "Surely your superiors would understand the circumstances." "My oath doesn't allow for convenient exceptions," James interrupted, his tone firm but not disrespectful. "The same commitment that brings me here to testify truthfully requires me to honor the protocols of my service." Someone in the back of the courtroom began to applaud softly, quickly silenced by a sharp look from the bailiff. Judge Pierce's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Enough of this theater," the judge snapped. "You will remove that sword before testifying, Captain, or I'll hold you in contempt." The prosecutor finally found her voice. "Your Honor, if I may cite Williamson versus Metropolitan Police, 2003, where the High Court ruled that judicial discretion does not extend to requiring officers of the Crown to violate their service protocols when those protocols are protected by statute." Judge Pierce glared at her. "Ms. Chen, are you suggesting I don't know the law?" "Not at all, Your Honor," she replied carefully. "I'm simply ensuring that the record reflects the relevant precedent." James remained standing at attention, his expression neutral despite the storm brewing around him. Inside, however, his mind was racing. He hadn't expected a simple testimony to turn into a battle over the very uniform he'd worn with pride for so many years. The sword at his side, never drawn in anger, had somehow become the center of this unexpected conflict. "Your Honor," James said quietly, "if I may add something?" The judge waved his hand irritably. "What is it now, Captain?" "This sword has never been drawn except in ceremonial duty. Like the uniform itself, it represents something larger than any individual, a tradition of service that dates back centuries." James paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I've carried this sword at royal weddings, state funerals, and while standing guard over crown jewels worth millions. It has never presented a danger to anyone, nor will it ever while in my care." A murmur of approval ran through the gallery. Even Patterson, the defendant, was watching with undisguised interest, his earlier smirk replaced by something that looked almost like respect. Judge Pierce drummed his fingers on the bench, clearly wrestling with his options. The law was on James's side, and they both knew it. More concerning for the judge was the growing sympathy for the guardsmen among those watching, including several people still discreetly recording on their phones. "What exactly did you witness on the day in question, Captain?" the judge finally asked, attempting to steer the proceedings back to the case at hand. James recognized the tactical retreat, but maintained his formal bearing. I was supervising the changing of the guard when Mr. Patterson approached the guard post. He began making obscene gestures and shouting provocations at the guardsman on duty, attempting to make him react. And did the guard react? Judge Pierce asked. No, Your Honor. The guardsman maintained his position as trained. When the police officers on duty approached Mr. Patterson and asked him to step back from the restricted area, he became verbally abusive and then physically pushed Officer Collins. Judge Pierce nodded, jotting something in his notes. And you witnessed this push directly? Yes, Your Honor. I was approximately 15 feet away with a clear line of sight. The judge looked up from his notes, studying James with narrowed eyes. The mockery had faded, replaced by a grudging professionalism. Behind him, through the tall windows of the courtroom, clouds shifted and a beam of sunlight streamed in, catching the polished buttons of James's uniform. Very well, Captain, Judge Pierce said after a moment. You may continue your testimony. With your sword, he added, the words appearing to cost him considerable effort. James nodded once, a simple acknowledgement without triumph. Thank you, Your Honor. Before he could continue, however, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A distinguished older man in formal attire entered, accompanied by 2 court officials. The entire room turned to look, and a wave of whispers swept through the gallery. The newcomer's presence seemed to instantly change the atmosphere in the courtroom. He was in his late 60s with silver hair and the kind of face that commanded respect without saying a word. His suit was impeccably tailored, and he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Judge Pierce's face underwent a remarkable transformation. The redness drained away, replaced by a paleness that made him look suddenly older. The court clerk hurried to his side, leaning down to whisper urgently in the judge's ear. Lord Justice William Blackwood, someone whispered loudly enough for James to hear. The name meant something even to James. Lord Justice Blackwood was not just any judge, but a senior appellate judge known for his fair-minded approach and deep respect for tradition. More importantly, he had served as military legal advisor to the Crown before his appointment to the bench. The courtroom had fallen completely silent. Even the defendant, Patterson, sat up straighter in his chair. The 2 court officials who had entered with Lord Justice Blackwood remained by the door, while the distinguished judge made his way forward through the public gallery. My apologies for the interruption, Lord Justice Blackwood said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. Please continue with the proceedings. Judge Pierce cleared his throat, shuffling papers nervously. Lord Justice Blackwood, this is unexpected. We're simply hearing a minor public disturbance case. The older judge nodded pleasantly. So I understand. I was in the building for a different matter and heard there was an interesting legal question being debated about proper protocol for uniformed service members. His eyes moved to James, taking in the full dress uniform with an appreciative glance. Captain, he acknowledged with a slight nod. James stood even straighter if that was possible, and gave a respectful nod in return. Lord Justice. Judge Pierce was visibly flustered. Now. We were just resolving that issue, my lord. The captain was about to continue his testimony. Lord Justice Blackwood found a seat in the front row of the gallery. Please don't mind me, carry on. But the damage, or perhaps the correction, was already done. The very presence of such a senior figure had shifted the dynamics completely. Judge Pierce smoothed his robes nervously and gestured for James to continue. Actually, Lord Justice Blackwood said before James could speak, since I've already interrupted the proceedings, perhaps you'll permit me to address a point of law that may be relevant? Judge Pierce had no choice but to agree. Of course, my lord. Lord Justice Blackwood stood again, turning slightly to address both the bench and the gallery. I believe, Judge Pierce, that you may wish to reconsider your treatment of Captain Harrington. The uniform he wears and the traditions it represents are protected by both law and custom dating back centuries. More importantly, they deserve the respect of every court in this land. A pin drop could have been heard in the silence that followed. Lord Justice Blackwood continued, his tone conversational, yet carrying unmistakable authority. In 1768, following an incident at the Old Bailey where a royal guardsman was forced to remove his ceremonial sword, King George III issued a royal decree that has since been codified into our modern legal system. That decree recognized that officers appearing in an official capacity represent not just themselves but the sovereign authority they serve. James stood motionless, barely daring to breathe. He'd known the law was on his side, but he hadn't expected such a powerful ally to appear out of nowhere. "I had a nephew who served in the Guard," Lord Justice Blackwood added, his voice softening. He spoke often of the weight of responsibility that comes with wearing that uniform. Not just the physical weight of the bearskin and ceremonial sword, but the weight of history and tradition. The expectation to embody the highest standards of conduct at all times. Judge Pierce was now staring at his desk, unable to meet anyone's eye. The prosecutor, Ms. Chen, had a small, satisfied smile that she quickly tried to hide when the judge glanced her way. "When Captain Harrington entered this courtroom today," Lord Justice Blackwood continued, "he did so not as an individual trying to make a statement or cause disruption, but as a representative of one of our oldest and most respected institutions. His appearance here is governed not just by his personal choice but by regulations that have stood the test of time." From the back of the courtroom someone began to applaud. Others quickly joined in, the sound building until it filled the room. The bailiff made a half-hearted attempt to restore order, but seemed reluctant to interrupt the moment. Lord Justice Blackwood raised a hand and the applause gradually subsided. "I believe," he said, looking directly at Judge Pierce, "that an acknowledgement might be in order." The younger judge looked as though he'd swallowed something particularly unpleasant. He adjusted his glasses, straightened his papers, and finally looked up. "How did you come to be here, Lord Justice?" he asked quietly. "This is a minor case in a lower court." Lord Justice Blackwood smiled slightly. "One of your court officers recognized Captain Harrington and was concerned about the direction the proceedings were taking. Knowing I was in the building for the Franklin appeal, he took it upon himself to inform me of the situation." James glanced at the court officers by the door, wondering which one had stepped out to fetch the senior judge. One of them, an older man with a military bearing, gave him the slightest nod. Judge Pierce took a deep breath, his expression a battleground between pride and the understanding that he had no choice but to back down gracefully. The courtroom waited, tension mounting with each passing second. "I believe," Judge Pierce finally said, turning to James, "that I owe you an apology, Captain Harrington." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The defendant, Patterson, was watching with his mouth slightly open, all his earlier smugness gone. "The court." Judge Pierce hesitated, visibly struggling. "The court wishes to acknowledge the validity of your appearance in full dress uniform, and the important traditions it represents." It wasn't much of an apology, but James recognized how difficult even those words had been for the proud judge to speak. He nodded once, accepting the gesture. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said simply. Lord Justice Blackwood seemed satisfied. "Well, then," he said, "I believe I've interrupted these proceedings long enough. Please continue with the captain's testimony." He sat back down, folding his hands in his lap. Judge Pierce nodded, visibly relieved to return to the case at hand. "Captain Harrington, you were describing the incident involving the defendant?" James resumed his testimony, describing in clear, precise terms exactly what he had witnessed that day near the palace gates. As he spoke, he was aware of the newfound respect in the judge's tone, the attentive faces in the gallery, and the quiet presence of Lord Justice Blackwood watching it all unfold. What had begun as a routine court appearance had transformed into something much more significant. A moment when centuries of tradition had been acknowledged and honored in a modern courtroom. James felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond personal vindication. It was about something larger than himself, just as the uniform had always been. The rest of the court proceedings moved swiftly after James completed his testimony. Patterson, the defendant, pleaded guilty to the charges, his earlier defiance, replaced by a subdued acceptance of responsibility. Judge Pierce sentenced him to community service and a fine, his manner now strictly professional, with none of the mocking tone he had used earlier. As the court adjourned, people lingered, many, watching James with undisguised curiosity and respect. A few approached to shake his hand or offer a word of thanks. One elderly gentleman with a military medal pinned to his jacket gave James a sharp salute, which James returned with perfect form. Lord Justice Blackwood made his way through the small crowd surrounding James. "Captain Harrington," he said warmly, extending his hand. "A pleasure to meet you properly." James shook the offered hand firmly. "The pleasure is mine, Lord Justice, and my thanks for your intervention." The senior judge smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "No thanks necessary. What happened here today matters beyond just this courtroom or this case." He lowered his voice slightly. "The way we treat the symbols of our traditions reflects how we value the traditions themselves." Before James could respond, Judge Pierce approached, his face a careful mask of professional courtesy. The crowd parted to let him through, watching with interest as he stopped in front of James. "Captain," he said, his voice carrying in the now quiet room, "the court wishes to extend its sincere apologies for any disrespect shown to you or the honored institution you represent." The formal public apology was unexpected. James caught Lord Justice Blackwood's subtle nod of approval from the corner of his eye. "Your service to the Crown and to this country is deeply appreciated," Judge Pierce continued, each word sounding as if it had been carefully rehearsed. "Please accept the court's apology for failing to show proper respect for your position and the traditions you uphold." James nodded, maintaining his professional bearing. "Thank you, Your Honor. Apology accepted." The tension that had filled the courtroom earlier had transformed into something else, a shared appreciation for a moment of recognition and respect. Several people began to applaud, the sound swelling until it filled the room. This time, no one tried to silence it. As James made his way out of the courthouse a few minutes later, he was surprised to find a small crowd waiting on the steps. News traveled fast, it seemed. Several people had their phones out, taking pictures or recording as he emerged. "That's him," someone said. The guardsman who stood up to Judge Pierce. A young boy, no more than 10 years old, pushed through the crowd to stand in front of James. He looked up with wide eyes at the tall figure in the bright red uniform. "My dad was a soldier," the boy said. "He said the uniform means you promise to be brave." James crouched down to the boy's level, his ceremonial sword carefully positioned at his side. "Your dad was right," he said with a smile. "The uniform is a promise to do your duty, to serve with honor, and yes, to be brave when it's needed." The boy nodded solemnly. "Dad would have liked what you did today. He always said you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." "Your dad? Sounds like a wise man," James replied, feeling a lump form in his throat. As he straightened up, a reporter from the local paper approached, notepad in hand. "Captain Harrington, could I get a comment about what happened in court today?" James shook his head politely. "Just doing my duty, nothing more. No comment needed." "But Judge Pierce has quite a reputation," the reporter pressed. "Many people would have backed down." James adjusted his uniform jacket slightly. "When you wear this uniform, backing down isn't an option. Not because of personal pride, but because of what the uniform represents." The reporter scribbled quickly. "And what exactly does it represent to you, Captain?" James paused, considering his words carefully. "Centuries of service and sacrifice, a commitment to something larger than oneself, a standard to live up to every day." He nodded politely. "Now, if you'll excuse me." By the next morning, the story had spread far beyond the local paper. Someone in the courtroom had recorded the exchange on their phone, and the video had gone viral overnight. "Royal Guard stands his ground against mocking judge," read one headline. "Tradition triumphs in courtroom showdown," proclaimed another. James tried to ignore the sudden attention as he reported for duty at the palace. His fellow guardsmen, however, had other ideas. As he entered the barracks, he was greeted with applause and good-natured backslaps. "Look what we've got here," called out his longtime friend and fellow guard, Robert. "A proper celebrity in our midst." James shook his head, embarrassed by the attention. "Just followed protocol, nothing special about that." "Nothing special?" Robert laughed. "You put Judge Pierce in his place. The man's been terrorizing witnesses for years." Another guardsman, a younger recruit named Paul, approached with a newspaper. "My mum called this morning to ask if I knew you. Said she nearly cried watching the video." He held up the paper, where James's photo appeared on the front page, standing at attention in the courtroom. Later that day, as James prepared for his shift, his commanding officer, Major Phillips, called him into his office. "Quite a stir you've caused, Harrington," Phillips said, though his expression showed more approval than censure. "Not my intention, sir," James replied. "Of course not." Phillips nodded. "Nevertheless, the impact has been significant." He handed James an official-looking letter. "This came from the Lord Chamberlain's office this morning." James accepted the letter with surprise. The Lord Chamberlain was the senior officer of the royal household. "They've received inquiries from the palace," Phillips continued. "Apparently, Her Majesty saw the news." James felt a jolt of alarm. "Sir, I never meant to cause any—" Phillips raised a hand. "At ease, Captain. They're pleased, not upset. Your conduct has been deemed exemplary and in keeping with the highest traditions of the Royal Guard." 2 weeks later, the Judicial Conduct Committee issued new guidelines to all courts in the country, emphasizing respect for military personnel appearing in court proceedings. The document specifically mentioned uniformed service members and their right to appear in official dress, including ceremonial items. Judge Pierce, it was rumored, had been quietly reprimanded and required to attend a sensitivity training course, focused on military protocols and traditions. James himself returned to his regular duties without seeking any personal recognition for the incident. When asked about it by new recruits or curious tourists, he simply said that he had done what any guardsman would do: uphold the standards of the uniform. But the story, soon dubbed the Harrington Incident in military circles, took on a life of its own. At the Royal Military Academy, instructors began using it as a teaching example of dignity under pressure and the importance of knowing both one's rights and responsibilities. For James, the most meaningful moment came a month after the courtroom incident, when he received a letter postmarked from a small village in northern England. Inside was a child's drawing of a guardsman in a red uniform standing tall. The accompanying note in a child's careful handwriting read simply, "Thank you for being brave like my dad. He would be proud of you too." James carefully folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket next to his heart before resuming his post. The bearskin hat was heavy, the sword at his side a constant presence, and the summer sun beat down mercilessly on his red uniform. But James stood motionless, back straight, eyes forward, embodying the very tradition he had defended, proving that true authority lies not in a person's position, but in their character when that position is challenged.